The Trump administration's handling of the Iran conflict has entered a phase defined by repeated public claims of diplomatic progress that are swiftly contradicted by Iranian officials, creating a pattern that is straining American credibility on the world stage. As economic pressures mount from the ongoing military engagement, questions are emerging about whether the administration's public messaging aligns with the actual state of negotiations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's recent suggestion of potential economic support for the United Arab Emirates has drawn scrutiny from congressional Democrats, particularly given the financial ties between the UAE and the Trump family's business interests. Earlier this year, the brother of the UAE's president acquired a 49% stake in World Liberty Financial, the Trump family's cryptocurrency venture. The New York Times has reported that the extent of any needed assistance remains unclear, but the intersection of diplomatic policy and personal financial relationships has raised concerns on Capitol Hill. The most striking example of the administration's diplomatic challenges occurred on April 1, 2026, when President Trump posted on Truth Social that Iran had requested a ceasefire. The president stated that the United States would consider the request once the Strait of Hormuz was open, free, and clear, adding that until then, military operations would continue. Within hours, Iran's foreign ministry issued a direct rebuttal, characterizing Trump's claim as false and baseless. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reinforced this position, declaring that the strait would not be opened through what it termed a ridiculous spectacle by the President of the United States. This exchange represents an unusually public diplomatic contradiction. The President of the United States announced that an adversary was seeking peace, and that adversary's government, military, and diplomatic corps responded simultaneously through official channels to deny the claim. The specificity of Iran's rejection language is significant. By choosing the terms false and baseless, Iran's foreign ministry did not merely dispute Trump's account, but accused the president of fabricating the claim entirely. The IRGC's characterization of the situation as a ridiculous spectacle further underscored the depth of the diplomatic breach. The internal contradictions within Trump's own April 1 statement compound the problem. The same post that claimed Iran had requested a ceasefire concluded with a threat to keep blasting Iran into oblivion back to the Stone Ages. These two assertions cannot coexist logically. If Iran were genuinely requesting a cessation of hostilities, the standard diplomatic response would be to engage with that overture. If the administration's position is continued bombardment, then the premise of a ceasefire request becomes incoherent. Even if Iran had made such a request, the president's own response would have rendered acceptance impossible. The timing of these events is particularly significant given the diplomatic groundwork being laid by other nations. On March 31, 2026, Pakistan and China had presented a 5-point peace initiative calling for an immediate end to hostilities and the delivery of humanitarian aid to the region. This represented substantive mediation through established diplomatic channels. Trump's April 1 post disrupted this process by transforming what Iran described as a routine review of proposals into a public claim of Iranian capitulation. Iranian officials clarified that they were reviewing American proposals delivered through Pakistani intermediaries, not accepting them. Pakistani diplomats were subsequently forced to spend the following day managing the discrepancy between the American president's announcement and Iran's actual diplomatic position. This pattern of premature declarations has become a defining feature of the administration's approach to the conflict. The April 1 incident was not an isolated event, but rather part of a recurring cycle in which public claims of progress are followed by swift Iranian denials, leaving mediators and allies to reconcile conflicting accounts of the same negotiations. The substantive diplomatic efforts that have occurred alongside the public messaging battle reveal the extent of the divide between the American and Iranian positions. On April 5, 2026, Pakistan introduced a detailed ceasefire framework consisting of 2 phases spanning 45 days. The first phase proposed an immediate cessation of hostilities, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and structured negotiations facilitated by Pakistani mediators. The second phase envisioned a permanent settlement, potentially including sanctions relief, in exchange for Iranian concessions regarding its nuclear program. This was a concrete proposal with specific mechanisms and established mediators. Iran rejected it. Instead, Tehran presented its own 10-point plan for a peace agreement. The Iranian proposal demanded the complete lifting of American economic sanctions, the removal of the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports, international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, compensation for war damage and civilian casualties, and a permanent peace agreement rather than a phased framework. These demands represent a fundamental reversal of the American negotiating position. Sanctions relief, which the Trump administration has consistently rejected as non-negotiable, stood at the center of Iran's proposal. Compensation for damages and recognition of Hormuz sovereignty directly contradicted ongoing American military operations. The gap between these positions proved unbridgeable. Rather than the 45-day framework Pakistan had constructed, a 2-week ceasefire was brokered on April 8th. This abbreviated agreement fell far short of what the administration had been publicly suggesting. Both parties have since violated its terms. Israel conducted what it termed Operation Eternal Darkness, executing 100 airstrikes across Lebanon in a 10-minute period, targeting Hezbollah facilities including headquarters, intelligence centers, missile infrastructure, and naval units. Israel announced the killing of Ali Yusuf Harshi, identified as secretary to Hezbollah's leader. Iranian officials reported additional Israeli violations of Iranian territory. The 2-week ceasefire functioned as a partial pause rather than a genuine cessation of hostilities. The maritime dimension of the conflict illustrates the ceasefire's limitations most clearly. On April 22nd, Iran's Revolutionary Guard fired upon a container ship in the Strait of Hormuz. The British military's United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center reported that the IRGC vessel did not issue standard hailing procedures before opening fire. Iranian state media offered a conflicting account, claiming the ship had ignored warnings from Iranian armed forces. The Revolutionary Guard subsequently seized 2 cargo ships, directing them into Iranian territorial waters, and attacked a third vessel, the Euphoria, which Iranian media reported had become stranded on the Iranian coast. These developments occurred during what the administration was publicly characterizing as an extended ceasefire. The Strait of Hormuz, which Trump had claimed on March 9th was reopened, remained an active conflict zone. Civilian commercial vessels were being intercepted while presidential social media posts discussed peace. The United States Navy contributed to the maritime tensions on April 19 by attacking and seizing an Iranian cargo vessel, alleging it was attempting to evade the blockade. American forces also boarded an oil tanker associated with Iranian trade in the Indian Ocean. The simultaneous seizure of vessels by both sides during a proclaimed ceasefire period underscores the agreement's tenuous nature. The question of which territories the ceasefire covered remains disputed. American and Israeli officials maintain that Lebanon was excluded from the agreement, while Pakistani mediators and Iranian authorities asserted otherwise. This fundamental disagreement about the ceasefire's scope persisted while Israel conducted one of the most intensive air campaigns of the war. The diplomatic infrastructure was fracturing in real time, even as public statements suggested progress. Vice President J.D. Vance had been scheduled to lead an American negotiating team to Islamabad for a second round of peace talks. CBS News reported that this trip was placed on hold as Iran rebuffed efforts to restart negotiations. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghai informed state media that no final decision had been reached regarding additional talks, citing what he termed unacceptable actions by the United States, specifically referencing the naval blockade of Iranian ports. The cancellation of a vice presidential diplomatic mission, while the administration continued to claim progress toward peace, represents another disconnect between public messaging and diplomatic reality. The current contradictions follow an established pattern dating back several weeks. On March 23, 2026, Trump claimed the United States had been in communication with a top person in Iran, stating that Iranian officials had initiated contact and expressed desire to reach an agreement. The IRGC-affiliated Fars news agency denied that any negotiations with Trump had occurred. Iran's foreign ministry clarified that it was reviewing American proposals delivered through Pakistan, not engaging in direct talks. Three distinct versions of the same diplomatic moment emerged simultaneously. The American president claiming direct contact, Iranian military media denying any negotiations, and Iranian diplomats describing routine review of third-party proposals. Earlier, on March 9th, Trump had declared the war very complete, pretty much, asserting that the Iranian military had been destroyed and the Strait of Hormuz reopened. Wikipedia's aggregated documentation from major news outlets notes that Trump repeated this claim of victory on March 24th, even as Iran continued missile strikes. The strait had not reopened. The Iranian military had not been destroyed. The president's characterization of the conflict's status was contradicted by ongoing military operations. This cycle has repeated approximately every 2 weeks. The president announces diplomatic breakthrough or military victory. Iranian officials issue prompt denials. Military activity continues. The pattern resets. The consistency of this sequence has created a predicament for allied governments and diplomatic mediators who cannot coordinate strategy around American statements that lose credibility within news cycles. The economic context adds another layer of complexity. Trump has publicly stated that Iran is losing approximately $500 million daily due to the naval blockade, figures that translate to roughly $3.5 billion weekly or $15 billion monthly. The economic pressure is undeniable. However, economic hardship has not produced the diplomatic capitulation the administration's rhetoric suggests. Iranian officials have demonstrated willingness to absorb substantial economic damage rather than accept terms they view as surrendering sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, accepting American influence over Iranian leadership, or abandoning nuclear program autonomy. The administration's defenders offer several arguments worth considering. Public declarations of progress can generate diplomatic momentum that quiet negotiations cannot achieve. Iran's rejections may reflect internal political constraints rather than genuine unwillingness to negotiate. Pakistan and other mediators have achieved limited but real progress despite the messaging chaos. Any temporary reduction in hostilities, even a partial one with violations, is preferable to continuous warfare. The economic blockade may yet produce concessions. These points have merit. Public diplomacy can shape outcomes. Domestic politics constrain Iranian negotiators. Mediators have maintained channels between adversaries. Temporary pauses reduce casualties. Economic pressure historically influences state behavior. However, the evidence presents significant challenges to this defense. The Iranian Foreign Ministry's false and baseless characterization of the April 1st announcement represents an unusually direct public contradiction of an American president. The 45-day framework's rejection in favor of Iran's maximalist 10-point plan demonstrates that the two sides occupy fundamentally incompatible diplomatic positions. The IRGC's ship seizures during the proclaimed ceasefire period confirm active conflict continuation. The cancellation of Vice President Vance's Islamabad mission and Tasnim's report that Iranian negotiators would not attend further talks indicate structural breakdown in the peace process. The repeated pattern of presidential announcements followed by swift Iranian denials has become so consistent that mediator nations themselves face whipsawed expectations. The consequences extend beyond the immediate conflict. When adversary governments can publicly label American presidential claims false and baseless without apparent diplomatic cost, the incentive to treat American statements as reliable diminishes. Allies find coordinated strategy planning difficult. Mediators expend resources managing gaps between announcements and reality. The broader diplomatic ecosystem suffers from eroded trust in American communications. The beneficiaries and casualties of this diplomatic approach are becoming increasingly clear. In the short term, the administration gains news cycle control through optimistic messaging. Republican candidates benefit from suggestions that the war is concluding. Iranian hardliners gain domestic advantage by publicly challenging American credibility. Pakistani mediators maintain central roles in the process regardless of outcome. The costs, however, are substantial. Military families lose reliable timelines for deployment planning. Allied governments cannot coordinate strategy around statements that adversaries promptly contradict. Energy markets remain volatile despite peace announcements affecting American consumers. Most significantly, each public contradiction of presidential claims compounds long-term damage to American diplomatic credibility. Several scenarios may unfold in the coming months. The indefinite ceasefire extension could collapse entirely, returning the conflict to active multi-theater operations involving Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf. Alternatively, face-saving mechanisms might emerge, allowing both sides to claim limited victories, though the Iranian 10-point plan and American blockade position remain structurally incompatible. The current pattern could continue, with periodic announcements of progress followed by Iranian denials, gradually eroding credibility while extending the conflict's duration. The partial ceasefire infrastructure could collapse, expanding the war across multiple fronts. The fundamental question underlying these scenarios concerns the reliability of American diplomatic communication. Previous administrations of both parties have generally recognized that public diplomatic statements require alignment with the actual positions of negotiating partners. The specific pattern of claiming Iranian ceasefire requests that Tehran's foreign ministry then calls false and baseless represents a departure from this standard with accumulating consequences. When presidential claims are consistently contradicted by counterpart governments within hours, allies reduce coordination with American public messaging. Adversaries learn that contradicting the American president carries no diplomatic penalty. Mediators are caught between official statements and operational reality. The entire framework for international negotiation deteriorates. The documented pattern is not a matter of partisan interpretation. It derives from specific reporting by Al Jazeera, CBS News, CNBC, Reuters, Euronews, the Financial Times, and direct statements from Iran's foreign ministry, the IRGC, Fars News, Mer News, Tasnim, parliamentary advisor Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, and foreign ministry spokesman Ismail Baghai. The April 1st false and baseless rejection, the IRGC's ridiculous spectacle characterization, the April 5th framework rejection, Iran's 10-point counterproposal, the April 8th two-week ceasefire, Israel's Operation Eternal Darkness, the April 19th American naval seizure of an Iranian vessel, the April 22nd Hormuz attacks, the suspended Islamabad mission, Tasnim's waste of time report, Kalibaf's ploy to buy time assessment, and the $500 million daily economic loss figure all appear in the public record. The March 9th pretty much complete claim, the March 23rd top person assertion, the March 24th victory declaration, and the continuing Hormuz violations form a consistent pattern of announcements followed by contradictions. These are documented events, publicly denied by Iranian officials, accumulating into a significant challenge for American diplomatic credibility. The implications extend beyond the current administration. The question facing American foreign policy is whether presidential statements regarding international negotiations should be reliable enough that other governments treat them seriously. The alternative, a system where adversaries routinely dismiss American claims without consequence, fundamentally alters the operating environment for diplomacy. For the military personnel still deployed, for the families awaiting definitive timelines, for the allied governments attempting to coordinate policy, and for the international system that depends on credible communication between states, the distinction matters. A diplomatic infrastructure that builds incremental progress through verified agreements serves different interests than one characterized by public posturing that collapses within news cycles. The coming weeks will reveal which trajectory prevails. Pakistani and Qatari mediators continue working behind the scenes, though private reports suggest frustration with the gap between American public statements and negotiating reality. The conditions most likely to break the partial ceasefire include further maritime incidents in the Strait of Hormuz, expanded Israeli operations in Lebanon, or Iranian decisions to abandon the Islamabad channel entirely. What remains clear is that the current approach has not produced the durable peace the administration's rhetoric describes. The gap between announced progress and documented reality continues to widen, and the costs of that gap, measured in credibility, coordination, and ultimately in lives, continue to accumulate.